afternoon to our community guests, Brock University students and colleagues, as well as our Freemasons friends. This is the 16th annual Sankey Lecture, and we are very glad to welcome everybody, whether you're with us in person here at Brock or listening on the live stream. My name is Professor Elizabeth Vlasak. I'm a member of Brock's Department of History. I'm also the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies for the Faculty of Humanities, and I am your MC today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. The territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis and Inuit, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Grand Master, Professor Deschamps, Freemasons friends, colleagues, students, community members, and all our guests joining us online from near and far, once again, welcome to the 2025 Sankey Lecture. For the past 16 years, the Sankey Lecture has provided us with an opportunity to learn together, and we've all been fortunate to broaden our understanding of the rich history and legacy of Freemasonry and fraternalism through the incredible variety of topics and themes that our past speakers have covered. And I'm really looking forward to learning more today. The Sankey Lecture is also an opportunity for Brock University to reconnect with our Freemason friends and to renew and further nurture the important relationship that we have enjoyed over the years. This relationship has enriched our teaching, our learning, as well as our research. In the 16 years of the lecture series, the Freemasons have generously donated to a graduate fellowship and have continued to help grow the Freemason collections in the university archives. Those collections are open to the public, and so if you wish to visit them, please contact Brock's Archives and Special Collections. David Sharon, our head archivist, will be delighted to assist you. The History Department has also offered an undergraduate course in the history of Freemasonry 4 times in the last 9 years. I'm now going to turn things over to Lauren Berry. I'm going to invite Lauren to come and speak briefly about her MA research. Lauren received half of the 2024-25 Grand Lodge Fellowship. The other half of the award was given to Carter Mowat, another one of our MA students who sadly was unable to join us today. Lauren, please come on.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lauren Berry, and I'm one of the recipients of the Grand Lodge of Ancient, Free, and Accepted Masons of Canada Scholarship. I'm happy to be here today to thank the Grand Masons for this honor. The thesis, which has been so generously supported, is called Panic and Popularity, White Women and Their Detractors in England, 1730 to 1810. My research analyzes a moral panic that emerged in the 18th and early 19th century England over the rise of celebrity, and particularly that of white female actresses. I argue that this panic is significant because it developed in relationship to ideas about fame, the public sphere, and white femininity that were distinct in this historical moment. In this period, there was considerable denigration over the profession of acting, and particularly about women acting. However, my research reveals that it was also possible for actresses to take control of the narrative around their work, with published works principally in their autobiographies. These are just some of the actresses I am studying. Their autobiographies have often been overlooked by historians, when in reality these texts are crucial in discussing agencies and intersections of gender, class, and race, and my research demonstrates that. I'm grateful for this scholarship not only because of the financial aid, but also because of the reassurance it has afforded me. It tells me that there are more people who want to see me succeed and believe in my work. As a first-year MA student, this is worth a great deal, and so again, I want to sincerely thank you for this scholarship.
Thank you, Lauren. It's now my great honor to introduce our Sankey lecturer this year, Professor Simon Deschamps. Simon Deschamps is a senior lecturer in British Studies at the Université Toulouse Jean Jaurès and a member of the research group Culture Anglo-Saxonne, or Anglo-Saxon Cultures. His research focuses on Freemasonry and Enlightenment sociability, as well as the British Empire, and more specifically, the history of colonial India. He has worked extensively on colonial networking, cultural imperialism, and globalization, and has written a number of articles on these subjects. He's also written a book entitled Sociabilité maçonnique et pouvoir colonial dans l'Inde britannique. I'll translate that. It is Masonic sociability and colonial power in British India, 1730 to 1921, which was published by the Bordeaux University Press in May of 2019. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deschamps.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me properly? Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the very generous presentation. Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear brothers and sisters, I would like to start, of course, by thanking Brock University for the invitation, and of course, in particular, Professor Mike Dreger, who has been so kind and available, so welcoming and fraternal. I would, of course, also like to thank the Ontario Masons and the Grand Master Jamie Island for the invitation. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for being here on a Sunday. It is, of course, a great privilege and a great honor for me to give this 2025 Sankey lecture and to walk in the footsteps of some of the scholars who have inspired me so much. I'm thinking, of course, of Professor Cécile Réboger, but also Professor Margaret Jacob, Jessica Harlan Jacobs, Susan Mitchell-Summers, Andrew Prescott, and so many others. So I think today's challenge will consist in attempting to sum up 200 years of Masonic history in India in the space of 50 minutes. Now, that is quite a challenge and probably also quite a fanciful idea. So what I'm going to do instead is maybe try and focus your attention on some of the main characteristics of colonial Freemasonry in British India. Of course, here we go. So here's my introduction. Let me start with an anecdote. This is March 21st, 1877. The Freemasons of Bombay gathered at the town hall to march in celebration of the Jamshedi Navroz festival, a religious festival traditionally celebrated by the Parsis. Thank you. The Parsis, a small religious Indian community, also the disciples of Zoroaster. And as you can imagine, this was quite a spectacular event in the sense that it brought together British and Indian Masons, and that they walked side by side in celebration of what was initially a native festival. In fact, in the speech that was delivered by Karshaji Ramsamji Kama, you have it on my slide, he declared, or he celebrated the fact that, I quote, "One of the happy results attained by introducing natives into Masonry has been that of bringing them closely associate socially with their European brethren. I was almost going to say masters." By then, Freemasonry, we are to understand, was one of the only forms of sociability that was open to native participation or native membership. Of course, that's only part of the picture, because Freemasonry was, of course, also part and parcel of the British colonial enterprise. It essentially drew its membership from the East India Company, which had received a charter in 1600, which gave it a monopoly over East Indian trade. And in fact, more specifically, in 1729, the Grand Lodge of England appointed Captain Ralph Farwinter, a Navy officer of the East India Company, as Provincial Grand Master of Bengal, entrusting him to promote Freemasonry in India. The following year, he warranted the first lodge in 1730, Lodge East India Arms number 72, which operated from Fort William in Calcutta. So in a sense, British colonial expansion in India came as an unprecedented opportunity to test Freemasonry's universalist ambitions. It also came as an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity to expand its colonial network. And I think this first overview, which I'm trying to share with you, provides for quite a sense of contrast, or possibly a sense of contradiction. Freemasonry in India was profoundly ambivalent. And what you see on my slide are some of the questions which I'd like to discuss with you, starting with what does the case of British India have to say about the workings of Freemasonry in a colonial context? To what extent did it impact the craft as a whole? More importantly, maybe, how was Freemasonry able to negotiate the tension which emerged from the obvious contradiction between its universalist and egalitarian ideals and the support it seems to have lent to British imperialism? I argue that British India, through its intricate system of colonial governance and the great complexity of its social structures, is a fertile ground on which to test Freemasonry's unique adaptability as a social resource. My point is, of course, to try and outline some of the main specificities of colonial Freemasonry. So this is what I suggest we do. I have four parts, four main points, and the first is the dynamics of Masonic colonial expansion. That is to say, what were the driving forces at work? If we are to believe Margaret Jacob, and I think we should, Freemasonry's great exportability was essentially the product of its universalist ideology. Freemasonry was the daughter of the Enlightenment. This we know because Cécile Révauget told us last year. Freemasonry, that being said, was also the daughter of many invented traditions. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, so 1723, James Anderson actually traces back the origins of Freemasonry to Solomon's Temple, the royal art, which spread all around the world, including India. And he actually specifically mentions India in the constitutions. Daniel O'Keefe describes this process or phenomenon as stealing the lightning. That is to say, adapting or adopting sacred texts and trying to provide a new reading of them. And I think this tactic of self-legitimization, and this is what we ought to call it, really set the scene for Freemasonry's expansion to India. And it was a continuous process. If you look at what happened a little later, so 1717, the Grand Lodge of England is created. 1730, 13 years later only, the First Lodge is created in India. 3 years later, the Grand Lodge of England actually wrote to the lodges in Calcutta, the Provincial Grand Lodge of Calcutta, asking the local lodges specifically to look into any traces or information they may find about the disciples of the great Zoroastrians in the hope to find the old remains of Freemasonry in India. That is a case of invented tradition. Local Masons were in fact put to the task of collecting this information and trying to provide evidence of Freemasonry's antique origins in India. This was part of what came to be known as the Masonic Foundation mythology. I think what is also interesting about this aspect of things is that it testifies to Freemasonry's strategy of depending on the man on the spot. The man on the spot was the man in control. He was entrusted by the Grand Lodge of England, and often the man on the spot was an influential patron, a high-ranking colonial agent. This was the case of Captain Rolfe Farwinter, remember, the first provincial Grand Master of Bengal. Why? Well, simply because he was the son of one of the board members of the East India Company, a man of significant influence and power. From the start, the growth and establishment of Freemasonry, and that is what I'm trying to get to, was intrinsically linked or connected to the economic and socio-political activities of the East India Company from the start. Lodge East India Arms, why? Well, simply because it adopted as a banner the arms of the East India Company. I think this really goes to prove the symbiotic relationship that existed between the East India Company and Freemasonry. If you look at the lodge membership lists, you'll find the same evidence. The first Indian or British Masons in India were essentially merchants, soldiers, and administrators of the East India Company. Another aspect of Freemasonry is in India is that it displayed great organizational capacity. I mentioned the Provincial Grand Lodge. The Provincial Grand Lodge was instrumental in the expansion of Freemasonry because it provided an intermediate body between the Metropolitan Grand Lodge and the local lodges. It acted as a link or connection between the two. The first was created in 1725, and so the Provincial Grand Lodge of Bengal was created, if you think of it, quite shortly after. They exchanged letters. The correspondence today are one of the major sources you can find in the archives of the United Grand Lodge of England that really testify to the level of connection that you could find between the Metropolitan Grand Lodges, the Provincial Grand Lodges, and the local lodges. They formed together a vast chain of correspondence, a vast Masonic communication network. By the late 18th century, Freemasonry had was established in the three major port cities of India, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. The number of Masonic lodges, just to give you an idea of the phenomenon, was 11 lodges in Bengal, 8 in Madras, 2 in Bombay in 1789. So it expanded quite quickly. You might think that's not that many lodges, and you would be correct. But you need to bear in mind that the European population in those cities was roughly somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 at the time. So it is quite significant. I think we can also say that Freemasonry was one of the first forms of sociability that was exported to India. It was at the forefront of the exportation of the kind of clubs and societies and sociability organizations you would find in the 18th century. But so what made Freemasonry so successful, if I may say? Why would the British in India join a Masonic lodge? What would have been their interest in doing so? Well, I think part of the answer lies in the quote you have on my PowerPoint. Edmund Burke, a speech on the East India Bill, a speech delivered in 1785. He described the East India Company agents as birds of prey and passage. She did not hold the East India Company in high regard. But what we have to understand is that mobility was one of the main characteristics of colonial society. People went from one place to the other. People spent a bit of time in India and often went back to Britain. And in that regard, I think we can say Masonic lodges were remarkably compatible with a highly mobile society, essentially because of their legacy. Their legacy, for instance, of their origins from a craftsmen's guilds, and the fact they were particularly adapted, because of that, to itinerant professions. If you look at some of the more specific dispositions, the Masonic certificate. The Masonic certificate was invented by the Grand Lodge of Ireland, and it worked as a passport. Once the Mason had his certificate, he could quite easily integrate local society and local respectability, well, a lot easier, let's say, than if he didn't. It acted as some kind of a passport. Combined to the right of visitation, it meant that the Mason could circulate a lot more easily within the colonial space. to illustrate this, maybe, the fact many colonial agents, in fact, were initiated on the very eve of their departure. I have an example here, which is that of Sir Charles Napier. He became the commander-in-chief and governor of the province of Sindh, so in the north of India. He was initiated in Guernsey as he was leaving Britain, and so the minutes of the lodge meeting read as follows, I quote, "Emergency meeting, Major Charles James Napier entered past and raised, he being about to leave the island." So he received all 3 degrees as he was leaving, and this actually became an issue. If you take a look at my slide, in 1784, the Provincial Grand Lodge of Madras actually wrote to the Grand Lodge of England and complained, I quote, "Utter Masons who are arriving and who are utter strangers to any knowledge of Freemasonry, proceeding from their being precipitately made past and raised on the eve of their departure for Europe. Freemasonry was therefore particularly well suited to the commercial classes of the East India Company, and it was, as I said, a passport. It facilitated their mobility to the colonial periphery. I now move on to my second point I'd like to make, and the second point has to do with, so what did the Masons do in Indian colonial society? And what was the place of Freemasonry in this Indian colonial society? And I'd like to start with a quote taken from a medical textbook. This is what it says. It says, "Ennui," so boredom, reigned triumphant, and unaccountable languor pervaded both mind and body of Englishmen in the tropics. I'm not entirely convinced by the medical evidence behind this claim. What I am more convinced about is the fact that lodges provided a cure to boredom. They provided entertainment at a time where there was little entertainment, and they, in that sense, provided a familiar environment, some kind of a reservoir of Britishness, if you prefer, that could easily contribute to making these British people feel at home, and also possibly strengthen their esprit de corps, federate them. In fact, they reconnected with what they had left at home, a world of great sociability when it comes to the 18th century again, a world where one's status was to be determined by how clubbable he was, belonged to different clubs and societies and so on. Calcutta was one of the early sociability places in India. In 1857, it became, I quote, "the leading overseas arena for British-style sociability and associations outside North America." So this would have been one of the high places of sociability before India. Just trying to check and still, yes. So there were, of course, as I suggested earlier, on other forms of sociability. There are plenty of clubs and societies. Most of them were offshoots of what you would find in London. I have a few examples on my slide: the Noble Order of Bucks, the Kutch Club, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, the Bombay Literary Club, the Calcutta Turf Club, the Bombay Bikla Club. There were plenty. There were plenty, and they contributed to this reservoir of Britishness. And yet, none of them could compete with Freemasonry in terms of the network they could claim. Freemasonry had a high degree of connection also with the local respectability. Most, or a majority, let's say, of Governor-Generals, including the Earl of Cornwallis, the Marquis of Wellesley, the Marquis of Hastings, the Marquis of Dalhousie, all of them were Freemasons. And so can you imagine the social capital this represented? You belong to the same kind of organization. You could claim and use that social capital in case of need in a society, or in a colonial society, that was quite precarious. It was a valuable social investment. It was also a connection with other forces at work in India. Remember, the British were not alone. The French were there. The French were there. And I found evidence of connections between the French and the British during the French Revolution. The example I have is the governor of the French factory of Pondichéry, le Chevalier de Fresnes. He was socializing with British Masons in Madras, and they all lamented the execution of Louis XVI, because a lot of them were royalists, okay? So trans-imperial sociability and in that respect, Masonic sociability transcended colonial rivalries, is what I'm trying to get to. I've talked about the social capital. What we need to understand also is that the British in India were obsessed with the image they gave off, or they gave away. They were obsessed with controlling that image. They sought to master public display. A good example of this is George Orwell. He explains that the British at the time were convinced that the Indian were particularly sensitive to pageantry, to show. In shooting an elephant, he explains he wears a mask and his face close to it, a sahib, so sahib being the word for master, has got to act like a sahib. Another example, in A Passage to India, E.M. Foster explains that the windows of the clubs were often closed off or barred, essentially because the British did not want the native population to see what was happening inside. I suspect the excessive consumption of gin might have had something to do with the matter, because, of course, the British would then have acted maybe not so much in keeping with their sense of respectability. In other words, I think empire was performed. Colonial power was performed. Freemasonry, and I'm getting there, played a significant part of that. This was something Jeffrey Alexander calls cultural performance. Freemasonry, of course, was particularly suited to the task because it had a long-standing tradition of performance, of public ritual, public ceremony, processions, cornerstone layings, of ritualized public performance. It did, at least in Britain, until the 1799 Combination Act, when it was more restricted. But in India, it went on with unabated enthusiasm. I'll give you an example. 1813, 120 Masons walked in procession to Government House in Calcutta to greet the new governor, Lord Moyer Hastings. He was a Mason also. And who had just been appointed. He was also appointed Provincial Grand Master of Bengal. Often you receive the two titles, if I may use a term, at the same time. What I'm trying to get to is that Freemasonry in India was ostentatious. It organized, as I said, public processions, banquets, cornerstone layings on an unprecedented scale. Events attended by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, in forms of performance or ritual that were tailored to impress, that were tailored to convey a sense of grandeur. A couple of examples, maybe. Not very representative examples, but still. This was the cornerstone laying ceremony of the Victorian Albert Museum in Bombay, 1862. Most public buildings, or the cornerstone of most public buildings, were laid with Masonic ceremony, most. Masonic public ceremonies, of course, were also in perfect agreement with the Victorian Code of Conduct the British sought to put on display, especially masculinity, manliness. You might think I'm exaggerating. No, I'm not. In 1854, in Bombay, soldiers were made to wear the moustache. This was by law, okay? It was by law because the British were convinced that wearing a moustache was a sign of manliness and that the Indian would be impressed by such signs of manliness. Representations, of course, but still. So, of course, not all Freemasons wore a moustache, but they were omnipresent in the public space. Just another illustration, which obviously I forgot to show you. This is the order of a Masonic procession. You can't read anything that is written, But you don't need to necessarily. My idea was just to give you a sense of how organized they were and a kind of military order that went with them. You have to imagine the brothers wearing their regalia. You have to imagine the music. It was quite a spectacle, quite a spectacle. Now, this show and the contribution of Freemasonry to the show, in a sense, became all the more obvious after 1857, so the Great Indian Rebellion, when the British legitimacy and authority in India was truly called into question. The East India Company was abolished then, and it became a crown colony. And so the British wanted to spin a new narrative, and this new narrative was about how Victoria was to become Empress of India, and how native princes were to swear allegiance to their new natural aristocratic ruler, Victoria. And this renewed their interest in imperial pageantry. It also renewed the interest in the rhetoric, the Masonic rhetoric of universal brotherhood. This was systematically put on display in the second half of the 19th century. So this is also something I forgot to mention, but it's okay, let's move on. When laying the foundation stone of the Elphinstone Dock in 1875, the Prince of Wales celebrated Freemasonry's potential to, I quote, unite together men of various castes and creeds in the bonds of fraternal brotherhood. This you might find an echo of in what, in 1890, the Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, who served as Commander-in-Chief and Grand Master of Bombay, also Governor-General of Canada, well, in passing, from 1911 to 1916. Well, he described his brethren, or the Masons, as, I quote, men of so many nationalities and creeds, but all imbued with the same true spirit of devotion to the craft and loyalty to our beloved sovereign. The Masonic rhetoric of universal brotherhood was instrumental in spinning this new narrative, and truly became a mantra that echoed across British India. I now move on to my third part, which is more focused on the boundaries of Masonic brotherhood and how India really called into question those boundaries. And I think you understand my point. What I want to discuss now is what treatment did the natives of India receive by Freemasonry. The first Indian Mason was Umdat ul Umha, the eldest son of Muhammad Ali Khan, the Nawab of the Carnatic. He was a prince, or the king of a princely state in the southeast of India, also a close ally of the British. He had supported the British against the French, as a matter of fact. Umdat ul Umha was initiated in 1776 at quite an early stage. 1776. He was initiated in the military lodge, number 355, Trichinopoly, by Terence Gallahan, a surgeon of the East India Company, surgeon or doctor, you could say, who also initiated his brother, Ameu ul Umha, just the following year, so that's 1777. I think these two first initiations are interesting and quite emblematic of what they initially were, essentially the product of initial enterprise. That is to say, or individual initiative, I mean. That is to say that this was not done with the official sanction of the Grand Lodge of England. This was the initiative of Terence Gallahan. It doesn't mean that the Grand Lodge of England was not interested in the matter, far from it. When the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, George Augustus Frederick, the future King George IV, was informed, he repeatedly stressed the importance of the allegiance between Britain and and the other kingdom, suggesting that his Masonic membership had strong diplomatic dimensions. In fact, the initiation of Umdat Ulumha probably paved the way for the next initiations that didn't take place in India but took place in London. The initiation of Mirza Abu Hassan Khan, the Persian ambassador, that's 1810. Another example would be Mohammed Ismail Khan, the ambassador of Oud, also in London, and in 1836. In a sense, what I'm trying to get to, my point, in fact, is that Freemasonry was very much used as a form of diplomatic channel. Most of the first Indian Masons were either political allies or trading partners of the British. Just to give you another two examples, maybe. The initiation of some of the Sikh princes, the Raja of Raputala, Randeer Singh, and his brother Bikram in 1861. Again, I think these are quite emblematic because they were essentially designed to reinforce the allegiance of the princely states. They were semi-independent kingdoms in India. And I actually have a map somewhere here, which illustrates my point. What you see in red were the territories under direct British control. What you see in yellow were basically the territories under indirect rule. Let's say that the British had struck alliances and signed treaties with those kingdoms in yellow. So they were heavily dependent on them. That's somewhere between 30 and 40% of the Indian subcontinent. They had to be trusted. And yet, the simple fact Masonic lodges opened up to native participation is quite remarkable. You have to imagine the time, you have to get the context. The context was that of urban centers and forms of sociability that were essentially segregated. Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay were divided into Black Town and White Town. The Bengal Club, founded in 1827, openly excluded, I quote, women, dogs, and Indians. In Burmese days, George Orwell described the club as, I quote, you have the quote on my PowerPoint, the spiritual citadel, the real seat of the British power, the nirvana for which native officials and millionaires pine in vain. He conveys this sense of segregation. There were, of course, exceptions. There were always exceptions. Some clubs were created to try and bring together British people, Europeans and natives. Two examples, the Calcutta Club or the Madras Cosmopolitan Club, but they were not successful. In fact, the Union Club came to be known as the Oil and Water Club. So Freemasonry, in bringing together the natives and the Europeans, the British and the Indian, that is quite unique, that's quite exceptional. My point being that the Masonic Lodge was very much a mediation space within this colonial public sphere. It was one of the venues in which commonality and alterity were negotiated, were expressed and negotiated. As the first natives were initiated, the lodges, local lodges, were made to define and redefine the limits of Masonic brotherhood. The real debate only started in the 1840s. In 1840, John Grant, the provincial Grand Master of Bengal, wrote to the Grand Lodge of England, asking him about the official position of the United Grand Lodge of England on the initiation of Muslim and Hindus. The answer, surprisingly enough, only came 2 years later, so 1842. The Duke of Sussex, so the Grand Master at the time, established that, I quote, you have it on my PowerPoint also, provided a man believe in the existence of the grand architect of the universe in futurity and extends that belief likewise to a state of rewards and punishments hereafter, such a person is fully competent to be received as a brother. So in a sense, I think the whole debate boiled down to how far British Freemasonry, then a Christian-dominated institution, was willing and compatible also possible, willing to open to and compatible with other religions. What is interesting in his answer is that, strategic conceptions are not entirely devoid from his letter. He also mentions, I quote, the importance of promoting friendly and fraternal sentiments between Europeans and enlightened Hindus. So, in theory, an Indian could become a Freemason. But of course, this was the point of view of the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. On the spot in India, not everybody agreed. I'll give you a couple of examples, maybe. If you take 1865, Brother Fenn, then an officer of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Bengal, he pointed out that, I quote, "We never could know the Asiatic intimately. There was a wide and impassable gulf between us, which nothing could bridge over. Men, though of the same blood, were not all alike. The word man did not always bear the same signification. There were various races, various ranks and various walks of life, and our race differed in every essential point from that of the Asiatic, so that we could never meet as brothers." He was not alone from thinking in those terms. Many of his contemporaries would have shared the same point of view, and other members of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Bengal shared that precise point of view. Another example, Brother Abbott, also an officer of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Bengal, he stated that he did not consider an Asiatic to be of our kind and would never sit in lodge with him. And yet, in the first half of the 19th century, an increasing number of Indians were finding their way into the lodge, and to the lodges, in fact. One of the major turning points was 1843, and it's an interesting landmark for us, because this was the creation of the first so-called native lodge. That is to say, a lodge that was specifically designed to welcome the natives that more often than not had been excluded from other lodges. This was created by the Scottish Grand Lodge for Western India. The name of the lodge was Rising Star of Western India, and it was created by a Scot, James Burns, who was then acting Grand Master of all Scottish Freemasonry in India. Now, the scene at that point was quite complex. You got native lodges, the number of native lodges increased, and you had also an increasing number of what we might be tempted to call integrated lodges, in the sense that they brought together both Europeans and Indians. I have a couple of examples I may show you. I'm very sorry for the poor quality of the pictures, but I couldn't do better. So this is an integrated lodge in Firozpur in 1890. You see two Sikhs, especially, that I wanted to attract your attention to. And another example is Lodge Carnatic. This would have been a native lodge, which was essentially composed of Hindu brothers. Now, there were plenty of these native lodges. As I said early on, some even had sometimes a denominational dimension. Lodge Cyrus was probably essentially Parsi, created in 1871. Lodge Aryan, 1873, mainly Hindu. And Lodge Islam, obviously mainly Muslim, created in 1876. And this concept of native lodge is highly problematic, really, because in a sense, the native lodge was an ideal compromise in the sense that it meant that natives could join Freemasonry, but they would have to do so more often than not in separate lodges. Separate, but equal. I'm not sure how that works. I'm not sure. And yet, the Native Lodge did also allow an increasing number of natives to join, and that's a fact. Let me move on, you will be happy to know, to my fourth and final part, which has to do with what I call the vernacularization of Indian Freemasonry. So I mentioned the Jamshedi Navroz Masonic Festival in my introduction. This was actually created in 1874 by K.R. Kama, probably one of the most influential Parsis of Bombay. And what was quite striking is that it was a traditional Parsi or Zoroastrian festival that was incorporated in the Masonic calendar, not on the lodge level, on the provincial Grand Lodge level, or district Grand Lodge level at that time. So this means that all the Masons of the district, or most Masons of the district, were happy with the idea and embraced the idea. What was Kama's argument? Well, Kama's argument was another instance of invented tradition, of course. He argued, I quote, that the Jamshedi Navroz festival had a relationship with Freemasonry, and that Freemasonry enjoyed its professors to study nature sciences, including the science of astronomy. Okay, so they had something in common. And so you can imagine that Freemasonry's universal ideal was particularly well suited to the syncretic ambitions, of Indian Freemasons such as Kama. How could they resist the temptation, knowing that the trend had been started by British Masons themselves? A couple of examples. This is a quote I gave you just before. A couple of examples. James Burns, I mentioned his name already. When he visited Lodge St. Andrew in the East in Pune, 1845, he's then the provincial Grand Master of Western India. He claimed, you have the quote on my slide, "No one who has studied history can doubt Freemasonry's connection, or rather identity, with the ancient mysteries of the Hindus and Egyptians and others that emanated from them." A bit of a wild claim, possibly. But these or such wild claims were very common. They were very commonplace. Freemasonry borrowed cultural elements from Indian antiquities, symbols, ritual, founding myths, and so on, and they integrated them to the Masonic foundation mythology. And this, obviously, the Indian Masons of the time were very happy to stress. Dadabhai Naroji was one of them. He stressed what Freemasonry and native traditions had in common, and so, in a sense, this invented Masonic tradition that was initially mainly the product of the British very much became a co-invented tradition. Dadabhai Naroji, also a member of Lodge Rising Star of Western India, an interesting character because he's also the first Indian MP in the House of Commons. Well, he drew attention to the fact, I quote, "The young Parsis, yet mere striplings of Masonry, are already showing the arrogance of contesting that if Masonry was not their own, they were at least fellow Masons from the earliest times." So if you think of it, fairly similar to what Burns had to claim early on. This was also increasingly common. Another good example. I'm sorry, the quote is very long, but you have to read it from beginning to end, because it is quite telling of this phenomenon I'm trying to describe. This is 1885, and Darasha Shishkar, also a Parsi, is visiting, or was visiting, the Grand Lodge of Scotland in Edinburgh, and this is what he declared. He explained to his Scottish audience that it is true that Masonry has its origins in the East, but owing to the decay and downfall of civilization and consequent spread of the spirit of religious intolerance, it left its shores and entered a far more congenial sphere in the West. The empire was then truly striking back. The idea was that Freemasonry was born in India, had left essentially because of religious tension, found refuge in Scotland and elsewhere, and had been brought back to its cradle by the British. Another interesting phenomenon, and which was also an important step in the vernacularization process, was, of course, languages, vernacular languages. And they were increasingly used in the Masonic Lodge. A lot of lodges actually operated in Urdu. They were essentially native lodges. But you would have found instances of vernacular languages being used also in integrated lodges. I'll give you an example. September 1889, in Lodge Orion in the West. This is Madras. Songs were sang in English, not very surprising. In Welsh, maybe a little more surprising, but also in Parsi. And this was an integrated lodge, so they would have been sang, or at least listened to, by brothers British or European and Indian. So the use of vernacular languages was important. It was, of course, not alone. You see the ritual here in Urdu. Other forms of vernacularization included the incorporation of Indian or objects of Indian culture and Masonic ritual. A good instance of this would be the incorporation of the Quran and the Avesta as volumes of sacred law on the altar next to the Bible in most Masonic lodges, integrated and native. And as this process operated, the process of closer identification of the lodges with different Indian religious communities, you also found an increasing number of their symbols. A good instance of this is Lodge Aryan. This is their banner here. And what you see right in the middle, I'm not sure you see it, but this is a representation of Shiva, one of the three main Hindu deities. And I think this illustrates my point quite well. So you might be thinking, okay, so the native lodges essentially incorporated those elements of native culture, Indian culture. I mean, it makes sense. But it went a little further than that, in Bombay at least, because new offices and new offices were created at the provincial or district Grand Lodge level. New offices such as the Grand Quran Bearer and the Grand Zendavesta Bearer. This is in the 1880s. These are two new offices, which I think truly testify to, first of all, the fact there were more Indians within the Masonic lodges, and also that at the district Grand Lodge level, the British were willing to accept, and they were probably even part of these ritual innovations. Now, interestingly, this whole process of vernacularization was concomitant or happened at the same time as the birth of the Indian nationalist movement, 1870s. And if we are to trust the anthropologist David Kurtzer, ritual provides an important weapon in political struggle, a weapon used both by the contestants for power within stable political systems and by those who seek to protect or overthrow unstable systems. What do I mean? Why did I put this up? Well, simply because I think you could consider ritual as one of the venues on which Indian proto-nationalist demands, or at least the demands for further equality, were being expressed and promoted. And if you think of the speech I quoted from earlier on by K.R. Kammer, the bit about "I was almost going to say masters" can be read in that particular light, possibly. I think Kammer, in a sense, was suggesting that Masonic sociability was instrumental in driving greater equality between the colonizer and the colonized. And this is an attention to equality, which you can find in a lot of other speeches. I'll give you another 2 instances, and then I'll move on. If you take a look at the claims of another Indian Mason, Nobin Chand Barao, so he was a Calcutta magistrate and Mason in his lodge in 1886. He enjoyed his countrymen, so Indians, to fully exemplify the precepts of Freemasonry before our European brethren, to show that we are not wanting in the essential qualifications of Masons, and prove ourselves worthy of all the Masonic honors. So we understand here that equality was a preoccupation at the time. And I think equality in the lodge, but also equality outside the lodge, because the second quote I took from his speech links what is happening in the lodge to what was happening outside. I quote what you have on my slide. If England, with its political constitution, social institutions, and religious establishments, failed within the space of nearly 100 years to recognize native society and raise its status on a par with that of England, it was undoubtedly a misfortune. But, brethren, England's mission has been fulfilled at last. So clearly, there's a link between the way equality was conceived in the lodge, the demands for equality in the lodge, and the demands for equality outside. You might think this is simply my interpretation. It is. It is. But what is interesting is that Barao was also a member of the East India Association, which had been founded in London in 1886 by Dadabhai Naoroji, remember the first MP in the House of Commons. And the aim or purpose of this organization was to promote further equality in India and also better political representation. So if you keep that background in mind, it would make sense. He was also a member of the Indian National Congress, 1885, which was the main organization, the main nationalist organization, which was created in 1885, and whose first president, Womesh, let me find his name again. Yes, Womesh Chandra Banerjee was a member of the Calcutta Lodge, Lodge Anchor and Hope. And in fact, if you look at the list of Indian National Congress presidents between 1885 and 1901, so that's 23 presidents in all, you will find that 11 of them were Masons. So clearly, there's an interesting overlap between the political scene and the Indian proto-nationalist movement and some of the demands for greater equality in the lodge that were being driven by Indian Masons. Right, I think I've been talking quite a lot, and it might be time to conclude. I can see smiles in your faces, which indicates happiness. So to conclude, a few words of conclusion. I think we can establish that by the beginning of the 19th century, Freemasonry had secured, British Freemasonry, had secured a permanent position in colonial India and was part of an extensive network that facilitated the circulation of men, information, and, of course, ideas. The members of Empire Lodge could legitimately boast about the fact the sun never set on an English lodge. This Empire Lodge in London was designed to welcome, to facilitate the integration of colonial Masons. Freemasonry very much pioneered the larger dynamic of exporting British sociability overseas, It displayed, as I indicated, great adaptability. I think we could say it was an object lesson in associational achievement. I also think that if the British Empire was indeed, and I believe it was an entire interactive system, one vast interconnected world, as suggested by the historian P.D. Morgan, I think Freemasonry was definitely one of its connective forces. Like so many other British cultural exports, Freemasonry was part and parcel of the colonial enterprise of the British in India. As I said, it fostered esprit de corps. In a sense, it oiled the wheels of the British colonial enterprise in India. I think it was central to it was central to colonial public life in India. It was part of the everyday life type of public display I mentioned. And it was also one of the early forms of organized sociability in which Indians and Europeans could potentially sit side by side. The Indians were not mere pawns in the game. They entered the lodges to affirm their status, claim greater equality. Masonic sociability, as I said, was one of the venues in which colonial relations were expressed and negotiated, and this is what allowed Indian Masons over time to incorporate elements of their culture in the Masonic tradition. So Freemasonry, in fact, is not an institution locked in time. It is profoundly shaped by the context in which it operates, and it is also very much the function of the men and women who embody it. They give it meaning, they give it purpose, they give it direction. This is further proof, if needed, that the boundaries of Masonic fraternalism are not immutable, and that they have and always will be pushed back, that was not wanted, to further the cause of greater diversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Deschamps, for that fascinating and really eye-opening as well as challenging paper that's really very thought-provoking. And hopefully there are a lot of questions, because we can now open the floor to those questions. So if you do have a question, either in person, if you're here in person or you're online, please put up your hand. Mike is going to monitor the online chat, and I will run up and down with a microphone. So please, the floor is yours.
So we do have the microphone, just testing it out now. Are there any questions that you might have initially?
Thank you, Professor. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the ancient rites as they were perceived around 1880, you say, that was that the beginning of the myth that Freemasonry was even older than we previously knew?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the Masonic invented tradition is first put in writing in the historical part of the constitutions in 1723. And I think what happened is that India simply provided an unprecedented opportunity to expand on some of the writings of Anderson. And this was first done by British Masons because they saw in India a number of symbols, which of course are very long-standing and ancient symbols that were adopted and used by Freemasonry, and saw a connection with what they were more familiar with, being Freemasonry. I also think that the Indian Masons were very keen to participate in the extension of this invented tradition, because they also saw a lot of commonalities. The Parsis especially, so the Zoroastrians, were particularly keen to see in Freemasonry a more modern expression of some of their more ancient traditions, rituals, and symbols. First of all, because it's provided a backing to their claim as Freemasons, but also maybe more generally because a lot of the Parsis I mentioned were very much modernizers and reformers of their own religion. And there would be a lot to say about how Freemasonry also contributed or fed their attempt to reinvent their own Zoroastrian traditions. And on that matter, there's a book that should be coming out this year, which is entitled The Zoroastrian World, and that was edited by Jenny Rose, which will partly deal on this idea of Zoroastrianism being reinvented to a certain extent by the generation, but 19th century or second half of the 19th century, especially Parsis.
Afternoon, Professor. I just had a question. You mentioned, I guess, racism between the English and the Indians, and the Scots Lodge kind of helped integrate that. Was there any fraternal visits between the Scottish Lodge via the Indians and the English lodges? Or was there any reunification with that?
It's a very interesting question. I think the first part of the answer I want to bring to your question is possibly why were the Scottish more open to the idea of native admissibility and native inclusion? I think part of the reason is because the Scottish were identified possibly to the empire in different ways, and there's a concept on amateur that is called phratriotism, which basically sets the Scottish aside from the British and would have tended, let's say, to make them more sympathetic to the lot or the condition of the native populations, at least in India, than the English. That's the first element. And also something else that comes to mind, Burns was a surgeon. And as surgeons, or the British that were surgeons, would have had a closer connection or contact with the local population because they spoke the vernacular languages. That was the case of Burns, for instance. He spoke Persian and Gujarati, I believe. And they also were interested in traditional medicine. So that created a deeper sense of connection. And then regarding the relationship between the English lodges and the Scottish lodges, they worked together. They worked together because the resources were so few in India, and the lodges, although the number of lodges quite important, were so evolved in such a small European community that they had to work together. And initially, to give you the example of Manikji Kursaji, he was the first Parsi to be initiated into Freemasonry. Initially, he applied to join Lodge Perseverance. Lodge Perseverance was an English lodge. They rejected him. So he went to England to meet Sussex. He failed to do so. Then he went to Paris, and he was initiated by the French. He was initiated by the Duc de Cazes and the Grand Orient of France. He returned to India, applied to Lodge Perseverance again, failed to enter, and 1 year later, Lodge Perseverance switched constitutions and became a Scottish lodge. So in other words, In other words, the lodges in India were structurally very flexible, in a sense that it could move from one warrant to the other, go into abeyance and for a few years and be reborn quite easily. In a sense, what I'm trying to say is that the means were so limited that there was a rivalry or competition was kept to a strict minimum.
Thank you, Professor Vlasak. Thank you so much, Professor Deschamps. My question is sort of along similar lines. I wanted to know kind of to what was the scope of the support amongst the more British and Scottish and English Freemasons within India for the more equality, kind of pushes for equality by Indian Freemasons, and kind of in tandem with that, were there any or to what extent were there examples of maybe elements of sort of a métissage, if you will, where they had maybe were there any elements of kind of the more local or native Indian culture that were adapted or adopted by colonial Freemasons?
I'm not sure I understand your question entirely, so you might have to.
Sort of maybe like what sort of, to what extent, what was the degree, amongst the population of sort of like white colonial Freemasons at large, to which there was extent for the push for more equality by the local Indian Freemasons?
I mean, it's the proportions of Masons that would have been in favor of admitting the natives and the proportion of Masons you would have been against is difficult to quantify. But what I can tell you for sure is that the whole debate that started in the 1840s lasted at least until the end of the 19th century. And the two quotes I showed you early on, which are quite shocking in terms of the blatant rejection of the natives, I only selected to try and prove how much some of the Masons were opposed to the principle, but I could have taken just as many quotes, if not more, within the same minutes of the Grand Lodge of Provincial Grand Lodge of Bengal, of Masons in favor of admitting them. It was really a debate, and I think 1843, so the creation of the first native lodge, was essentially a compromise. But basically, once this lodge was created and more native lodges were created, yeah, you can deny the fact that they were Masons, that the Indians who had joined those native lodges were Masons, and from then on, it became a lot more complicated to systematically reject Indians on the base of their race or ethnicity.
Thank you, Professor. I was just curious to know what we know about Zoroastrian practices in Masonic lodges to this day, within Parsi communities especially, as Zoroastrianism is not heavily practiced outside of very small subsects.
So you're talking about today in our...
Yes, how is the past affected now?
I have no idea,
okay.
Quite frankly. I know that having been to India actually not so long, in 2017, I know for a fact that the Zoroastrian community is still prominent in Bombay and the Bombay area. I know for a fact that there are still a lot of Masonic lodges and still a lot of Parsis to be found in those Masonic lodges, which would tend to suggest that the interest of Zoroastrians and Parsis in the Masonic lodges is still very much there, but that's about all I can tell you, I'm afraid. It is a very interesting question, possibly material for future research.
Sorry, not a question, but I might address that. Yeah. Having been to lodge in India a decade or so ago, the Grand Lodge of Western India has a lot of Parsis in it. In fact, when the Grand Secretary Emeritus is Parsi. So they're very active.
Thank you, David, for the clarification. I have a question from the live chat. It is from Santosh, perhaps a name that some of you know. I don't remember this person, but thank you, Santosh. Dear Professor Deschamps, Santosh writes, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And then a note of interest. I'll interpret the question a little bit because it stands out, Santosh's question stands out for me. The question, or it's an observation, regards the poem The Mother Lodge by Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling, says Santosh, captures the spirit of interaction between British and Indian members. I'll add by noting that I don't think you mentioned Rudyard Kipling, and I do wonder, Kipling perhaps both an example of humanitarian masonry and also an example of a British superiority?
Yes.
That's just an open question.
I entirely subscribe to your analysis. I did not mention Rudy Kipling. I could have mentioned Rudy Kipling because he indeed wrote the poem The Mother Lodge, which you might be familiar with. He also wrote The Man Who Would Be King, which is essentially about how Masons reached this native population and become kings because they used their Masonic knowledge and ritual to become kings. Now, in the Mother Lodge, Kipling celebrates the fact he's in an integrated lodge. I can't remember exactly how the poem goes, but he mentions all religions being represented, and most of the religions being represented in his lodge. And this is often interpreted as the proof that he was very open to native society, very open to native participation, very proud to be part of an integrated lodge. But what I find is that if you read Kipling, then you also, of course, have to read The White Man's Burden, I'm afraid. And once you've read The White Man's Burden, then you might question this very positive light being cast on Kipling. And what also strikes me with Kipling is that basically he describes all forms of interactions between British society, Europeans and Indians, including in Kim, which you might be familiar with also. But what strikes me more so is that every time colonial society is overturned in his fiction, at the end, it all comes back in the right order. And Kim is that. Everybody goes back to where he belongs. And so the thing is, it's not a sentence I'm pronouncing on Kipling. I'm just saying we need to be really cautious of Kipling because there are indeed indications of his openness to native society, but there are also indications of the fact he was a jingo imperialist. In fact, if I can quote George Orwell about Kipling, he said of him that he was morally insensitive and aesthetically disgusting. That's a bit harsh. It's a bit harsh. It's a bit harsh. I'm not sure I agree entirely, but I really think we need to be cautious when it comes to the Mason that was Rudyard Kipling, for those precise reasons. One last thing that comes to mind, he also had a very good friend in Rhodesia at the time, Cecil Rhodes, and as we know, Cecil Rhodes was not very open to native society and not the most liberal man.
I do have another question, but before I pose any question, is there anything else that members of the audience might like to ask right now? I could take a turn running around.
I can speak, I think, loudly enough.
It might be good for the live stream if you speak into the microphone, because it could be good for the folks who are listening in.
Thank you very much. Were there any literary translations made by local languages of the work and of the ritual?
Do you mean translations from the English or ritual in English to the ritual in the vernacular languages? Yeah, yes. You find I only had one of my slides that dealt with the matter, but what the slide I had was the lodge or a ritual, lodge ritual in Urdu. And you would have found the same, I know for a fact, in Farsi and in Gujarati also. For the rest, oh yes, actually, no, I think that's about all the evidence I found in the archives. Okay.
I have a question. I'll raise my hand. You mentioned that you said 11 presidents of the Indian National Congress between 1885 and 1901 were members of the lodge. I'm just wondering, how did other members of the Indian National Congress who weren't members of the lodge feel about that? Were there debates going on about whether this was an advantageous type of involvement? What happens after 1901? I'm just wondering too, what happens after the First World War in particular?
Were there any debates? Not really. I think there were no debates essentially, well, at least to the best of my knowledge, essentially because between 1885 and 1901, the leaders of the Indian National Congress were essentially in favor of negotiating with the British, and they were essentially moderates. And most of the 11 presidents of the Indian National Congress whom I mentioned would have been moderates. And it would appear, but this would also require further research, that the so-called extremists, so the other faction of the Indian National Congress, that were excluded from the Indian National Congress after they had grown in influence. I think it's in the Surat split, that's 1907. We're not interested in joining Freemasonry at all. I'm not, again, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not entirely sure why, although I suspect it could possibly be because at that point, well, this was quite a turning point in the history of the Indian nationalist movement, in the sense that the extremists were becoming more prominent, and the moderates had, to a certain extent, or were becoming less influential and less convinced, or were less credible in terms of what they could obtain from the British. Interestingly, Dadabhai Naoroji was the president of the Indian National Congress, who actually put Swaraj, which literally means is another word for independence or self-rule, in the agenda of the Indian National Congress, and that was in 1907, I think. So there were no debates because it was not at all controversial. It could only serve the purpose of the moderates, and the moderates essentially were involved in a struggle for more equality and also to be better represented in the Indian legislative councils, and they also were very much in favor of defending their own interests, being part of what was known as the covenanted civil service, so the most prestigious part of the Indian civil service, which they had been systematically denied access to, or more or less. So I think that there's in the way I saw it, but again, it might require further research. I think the interest in Freemasonry dwindles slightly because as the movement becomes more radical, in a sense.
Simone, I have a large number of thoughts and ideas and questions bubbling through my head. What I might ask you to do is to go to your slides near the beginning of the second part of your talk, because I've got what I think might be something like the first slide, right there, that one with the list, the next one with the list of Governors General and Freemasons. These are Governors General of India?
Yes, yes, yes.
Now, what I think is that these men had connections with Canada as well in many cases, right?
Now I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that question. But what I know for sure is that some of them were. I seem to believe that there's a connection. Wellesley definitely has a connection. Cornwallis has a connection too. And I also know for a fact that this is quite typical of the empire. Colonial administrators often went from one site, one geographical area of the empire to the next. We saw the example of I forget his name now, Arthur, the Duke of Connaught.
The Duke of Connaught, yeah.
Yeah, and who basically went from being Governor General of, Commander-in-Chief of Bombay, and then becoming Governor General of Canada, so that's 1911 to 1916. Possibly another interesting example, although he was not a Freemason, would be Governor Eyre. A very infamous man, because he's the one who repressed the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865 in Jamaica. And before he repressed the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, he was busy repressing the indigenous population of Australia. What I'm saying is there was a lot of circulation, and they would have been sent from one colony to the next.
Was there a similar kind of connection between Freemasons and colonial leaders in the French Empire in the 19th century?
That's a difficult one.
The bigger question that I'm wondering about is, could England and Great Britain was a relatively small island nation or set of nations that had this huge global empire. Would the British Empire have been possible without Freemasonry? Was it a connective tissue of power?
No, clearly it would have been possible without Freemasonry. As I tried to suggest early on, I think it really oiled the wheels of the empire. It was part of the cultural apparatus that basically facilitated the empire, facilitated the implantation and integration of colonial societies and colonial agents in those societies. But I think it would have been possible without it. It was only one of the many cultural forms and cultural forms of imperialism that was to be found, or that were to be found in the empire. And regarding the French Empire, I'm afraid I don't know. There are works on the French Empire. One on, I can think of a PhD thesis on Mauritius. And there were many interactions between French Freemasons and British Freemasons. And I know of many of such interactions in India, especially in the 18th century. One of which I mentioned, so 1793, the brothers of Madras, British Freemasons, socializing with the French Masons. I also found a number of anecdotes by, so obviously the British and the French waged war against each other in India, and I found instances of, Freemasons making their traditional signs and benefiting from better treatment because they were Freemasons. Suffren, for instance, was a Freemason, l'Admiral Suffren. He was involved in the Indian Ocean, and there's a whole anecdote I found in the archives of British officers being made prisoners who happened to be Masons, and them socializing on the ship, and him treating them with this, or giving them particular favors. Now, I wouldn't want to over-exaggerate the importance of Freemasonry in those
That's my job.
Because there was the special treatment that was received by British prisoners was also because they were officers. And there was a social dimension. It was a very aristocratic form of cosmopolitanism that you can find that, that was age-old. That was a long-standing tradition. Think of the Grand Tour, again, the 18th century. Aristocrats, because they shared the same codes and values and so on, were able to transcend national differences, national rivalries. And that might be an instance of it. So again, Freemasonry might have oiled the wheels, but I don't think we can turn it into the crux of the matter, of the core of, or the core of what made the British Empire so great in terms of size, of course.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one, maybe two more questions, and we have a friend and colleague of the Sankey lecture here, Bill McIntosh from Brock.
Simon, merci. I don't have a question. I'm hoping you can free associate on a couple of terms you used. The first is mobility, and the second is contradiction. And I was through the talk, I was thinking about a quote from Mimi Scheller and John Urry at the beginning of the Mobility's Turn literature, and they say. Mobility is the enemy of civility.
Is the enemy of?
Civility.
Okay.
And we know that Freemasonry's origins are in this, social construction of civility, and I wonder if you agree with that statement.
That's also a difficult one. I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. What I do know is empire was very much about circulation, and it was not so much about civility in many ways. But if we look at the type of circulation, we often tend to see it as being, forced forms of circulation from the motherland to the colonial periphery, and we tend to omit how much the motherland was itself shaped, changed, and reformed to a certain extent by the colonial periphery, which is why I find the description, P.D. Morgan's description of the British Empire as this vast interconnected world, quite compelling or quite satisfying in that regard, because even, in terms of Masonic orders, there's a Masonic order that was called the Royal Order of Sitka and Satbai, I think. It translates something along the lines of the Sacred Order of the Set Brothers and Sisters. I'm not entirely sure about the translation, but what I know is that it's very emblematic of that kind of circulation by which Freemasonry in the motherland was orientalized to a certain extent. So, of course, orientalized in the sense that the ritual symbols and so on that were adopted by the Metropolitan Masons and the new orders were very orientalized in the Said sense of the term. That is to say, they were representations of the British of the Orient. But still, circulation is very much or had mutual results. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I did try to dodge it as well as I could.
If there are no additional questions, please join me in thanking Professor Duchamp once again. I would now like to invite the Grandmaster Jamie Ireland to say a few words.
Professor Michael Dredger, past Grandmaster, current Grand Lodge officers with us here today, members of our great fraternity, students of Brock University, Brock administration, ladies, gentlemen, and guests. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all to the Charles A. Sankey Annual Lecture in Masonic Studies on behalf of the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario. Ontario Masons have been partnering with Brock University for, I'm going to say 12 years. How far off am I? 16? 16, yes. For 16 years now. And it's been a great vehicle for us as Masons to get better recognition through Masonic studies. Michael Dredger, thank you for all that you do to organize this and make sure that it continues. Our relationship has worked out great, and I thank you and Brock for helping your students to learn about the history of Freemasonry from a worldwide perspective. Thank you so much. I want to thank our Masonic Education Pillar Chair, Right Worship Brother Jim Circum. Your dedication on keeping the history of Masonic events recorded is a huge part of our past and our present. Absolutely. Thank you so much for all you do. The partnership with Brock University is important to us, and we appreciate the positivity that this initiative generates. I also want to thank Right Worship Brother Jamie Wark, the Membership Pillar Chairman, for overseeing today, as well as Right Worship Brother Michael Martin, for working with Michael Dredger to iron out the details, which brings us all together here today, this afternoon. And I thank you for the work that you put into this, Michael. Thank you so much. Freemasonry and colonial power in British India. What a great presentation that was. Although we've had many men of influence, and as you call them, men that have oiled the wheels in our presence through history, I am absolutely proud to say that in our Masonic lodges, no matter what our vocation is, our stature, we are all brethren, and that is what holds us together. It is a great virtue that we have. So, sometimes I'll say that, Masons, they really don't run the country, but they've had an influence. Absolutely. Great presentation. I want to thank our Grand Lodge Scholarship recipient for the work that you do, your research in progress. Lauren Berry, thank you so much for everything. We are so glad to be able to help you out in your research with a financial contribution. It makes us feel good for sure, and congratulations on everything you're doing to further Freemasonry. The program MC, Professor Elizabeth Volosik, thank you so much for helping to put this on today. Absolutely. I want to thank you all. God bless. To our membership, let's all be proud Ontario Masons. And to the non-Masonic members here today, thank you for your time, your interests, and your supporting this Masonic lecture series between us and Brock University. And I want to, Professor Simone, if you could please come up here. I know that you're wearing I don't know if anyone can hear me, and I know you're wearing a Masonic pin, but it's not our Masonic pin. Do you mind if I poke this in there? Not true. If I could present you with this, it is our Ontario Masons recognized pin. It is part of our Ontario Masons branding, and I'm so proud to present you with that today. Thank you again for your wonderful presentation. Another one of the greatest virtues ever, no matter where you go in this entire world, give or take, right? We are all brethren. And again, it's the greatest thing ever to belong to this fraternity. And for us, it's the greatest thing ever to be a proud Ontario Masons. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Michael, for putting this all together as well.